Okay. Well, welcome everybody, and welcome to day 3 of the CAAS Can you hear me at the back? I don't have to be any louder? Okay.
I can hear you guys.
There's the voice of God coming from the ether. Welcome, Frey. So we have both an Ottawa audience and an audience in Addis Ababa, right?
Yes.
All right. So there's Frey. This is the changing role of radio for development in Sub-Saharan Africa, and we are dealing with largely with the technical capacity of organizations using communications, and particularly more modern communications in pursuit of development. And I have to say, just at the beginning, something like "at last," because so much of development activity in Africa starts with some development agency having a great idea that's either developed in the brains of scientists, or perhaps there's even been consultation with the affected people, and they get together and they design a whole project, and then at the very end they say, oh, we have to promote this, so that they add 1% of the budget for communications. And of course, it's all wrong. That's communications for development is an essential part of any development project, and has to be woven in from the very beginning of the design of any development project. And that has not gotten across to a lot of organizations yet. And we end up dealing, and even the Gates Foundation, whom we work with, they said, look, we got a lot of people working out there. They have no way to go that last mile, that mile to the farmer, that rural person who we want to help. And that's something that's been very important for us at Farm Radio International. And today, I'm delighted that we have a panel, and I'm honored to be here with 3 of my colleagues, all of them farm radio people. All of them happen to be women. And they're all bright women, slightly younger than me. And they are going to be speaking. And then I'm going to try to make some intelligent conversation in between speeches, and there'll be lots of time for the audience. Can you still hear me at the back? To raise questions or to engage in our discussion. So I think kicking it off is going to be Sheila. Is that correct?
Sure, yeah.
Sheila Rao is a research communications specialist with Farm Radio International. She's currently managing several projects in Africa that focus on integrating radio programming into research dissemination strategies. Current projects focus on child's nutrition, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Uganda, Tanzania, and supporting climate-smart agricultural practices in northern Ghana. Over to you, Sheila.
Thanks. So my talk today will look at the use of communication technologies in agricultural development in Sub-Saharan Africa. I'll start by providing a brief overview of the use of technologies in agricultural development. I'll then take a look at past studies and programs that have tried to integrate ICTs. And we'll call these ICTs first generation ICTs. I'll then briefly discuss the case study of the African Farm Radio Research Initiative. This was a 4-year research for development project out of Farm Radio International that looked at the use of radio and technologies to improve farmers' agricultural productivity. I'll then look at second generation or Radio 2.0 ICTs and the learnings we're starting to find through Farm Radio's work and the results of AFRI. And then I'll briefly talk about AFRI's future work and research in this area. So, after decades of agricultural research experience in Africa, farmers still require adequate access to resources, including information and knowledge on production, inputs, including seeds and fertilizer, and further dialogues between suppliers, markets, and other farmers. Extension services and officers out of those services, and those that have direct contact with farmers, and whose role is to support the production, are often understaffed and under-resourced. where in some countries the ratio of extension worker to farmer is 1 to 2,000. As a result, a lot of the agricultural development actors, including ministries, agricultural research centers, and NGOs, started to look into the possibility of using technology to provide greater reach to farmers and to provide them with the resources and information they need. Some of these examples in the past, from about 1990, the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s, including the setup of telecenters in rural communities. These telecenters provided internet connectivity, tried to provide internet connectivity, telecommunications, and fax machines, with the idea that farmers would be able to have access to information through these uses of technologies. Radio programs were also part of strategies. They were used to provide technical information to farmers in farm programs, usually provided through extension services. Radio stations were only there to provide the information. They were not involved in the programming or the development of programs. Through this first phase of integrating technology into development, some of the issues that came out, or some of the challenges they found, were that information was too technical. So the information that was shared through radio programs was often inaccessible to farmers. It was also inappropriate at times, where it wasn't able to address real issues that farmers were dealing with at the time. They were also fragmented. So examples of the use of SMS in the early days provided only market prices. And market prices was just one part of information that farmers needed to make informed decisions about their market needs. A lot of these early initiatives also excluded local and farmer knowledge, simply because the farmers weren't engaged in the generation of the knowledge and the information. And women were also unable to access the information, either because they had no access to the technology, or and the information was often irrelevant to their needs. In 2005, Farming International was approached by the Gates Foundation to develop a research for the development project to look at the use of radio and technology to improve agricultural productivity. It was a 4-year project taking place in 5 countries. 25 radio stations were involved. A total of 25 market information services were developed, and 49 participatory radio campaigns were designed. Participatory radio campaigns was a new approach developed by Farm Radio International that specifically looked at sharing information around a particular agricultural practice that enabled farmers to make informed choices about what they wanted to do to improve their productivity. Just to give a bit of background, participatory radio campaigns are farmer-centered and farmer-approved. They bring together a number of different actors in agricultural development, including farmer organizations, extension services, and researchers. They're usually 4 to 6 months in duration, and there's often new ICTs that are integrated with radio to help with interactivity. A variety of different radio formats are also involved. Just to give you a little background on the experimental design, in assessing the effectiveness of these radio programs through AFRI, for each radio station, a few communities were selected. Some communities were called ALCs, which were active listening communities, directly involved with the radio programs. PLCs were listening communities that listened to the program but were not directly involved with radio stations. And control communities were communities that had no access to the radio programs. Through this design, we were able to assess how the impact of the radio programs. It was found that in the PLCs, so the communities that were only able to listen to the programs, 21% were able to try the agricultural practice that was highlighted in the program. 52% of the PLCs were also able to gain a substantial amount of knowledge about the agricultural practice. We also found that there was a direct correlation between the level of listenership and the level of knowledge gained from the PRCs. The knowledge also was helped to facilitate initial adoption, meaning the knowledge gained also had a direct correlation with the amount of the number of people that were able to try the agricultural practice. AFRI allowed us to introduce this idea of Radio 2.0, where the technology focused on interactivity, better accessibility, affordability, and the usability for farmers. Some of these examples include the convergence of radio mobile phones. We used mobile phones to provide SMS alerts. Excuse me. SMS alerts were used to remind farmers, remind listeners that the programs were coming on 30 minutes prior to the start of the program. This led to a potential increase of 20%. Another example of the use of mobile phones was on-air call-outs to farmers and experts. This provided broadcasters an opportunity to diversify their voice on the radio programs and enabled farmers to be directly involved in the program. Portable low-cost MP3 recorders were also used. This allowed broadcasters who previously remained in studio and only used their production in studio, the ability to go out to the field and speak to farmers and other actors within agriculture development, to include them in their programming. It could also be used as file storage, which meant that programs could be stored and used as repeat programs and also shared outside of the radio station. This also meant that community stations that were often resource poor were able to have access to digital technology that they weren't previously able to have. Another example of a second generation technology was this idea of voice-based services. So an automated messaging system that was connected to radio stations. This allowed radio stations to program pre-recorded messages for farmers to call in and listen to. So some of the information they could provide through this system was market information, repeat programs, and agriculture information. It was also provide an opportunity for farmers to have feedback on their programs, to ask questions, so that broadcasters could answer these questions on the next program. So some of the potential contributions that we found Radio 2.0 could have. It provides a better communication platform for agriculture development, which strengthens the linkages between researchers and development practitioners. It increases the engagement and interactivity between diverse actors, including farmers, researchers, and extension. And it also provides an opportunity to include farmer knowledge. Some of the considerations we look at in our future research and our work is the ownership of the technology. Who owns the ownership and who manages it? How do we monitor its use and record its effectiveness and evaluate its effectiveness? How do we build the capacity for sustaining the use of this technology in the radio stations and in overall agricultural development? How do we improve the access for women in to technology? One example we're looking at now is developing listening groups for women with MP3 compatible radios, so that women can listen on demand and in real time to the radio programs. And we're also looking at the misconceptions of communication needs in research and program design. So a lot of times we find that communication is often is often excluded in the design aspects of agricultural development programs. It's often a second thought and not considered part of the overall project or the overall objectives. If it was considered of the overall objectives, radio broadcasters and the radio component would be considered a main partner in the programs, and the scalability of the research can potentially be reached at a greater level. So some of the current research we're looking at is improving on the on-demand farmer feedback systems through either survey applications or smartphone applications. We're also looking at designing better monitoring tools to assess the effectiveness of certain technologies in our programs. Thank you. And
Okay. And you came in at 12 minutes. That's good. Gilbert, you better remember that.
Oh, don't worry.
All right.
I'm good. Okay, should I put yours up then?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there's any need for me to comment in between, any clever comments. I'll have some things to say at the end.
Okay.
Does anybody have any questions or clarifications they want from what Sheila
Should we
said?
allow Frey to go first? Oh, doesn't matter. Frey, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Should we have Frey?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, while we know that we have a connection, Frey, okay, now, are we going to be able to record Frey? Where is, it'll pick up from that.
Should I put it over here?
Oh, it's just going to come from speaker.
Okay, let me just introduce Freyhawat Nadu. Frey is the country director for Farm Radio International in Ethiopia. She previously has worked as a journalist and a communications specialist with various national and international organizations. Our current projects in Ethiopia focus on staple crops, on climate-smart and nutrition-sensitive agricultural productivity, and on a nutritious maize project for Ethiopia. Frey, over to you, and welcome to Ottawa.
Thank you. Well, I'll be talking about the experience from Ethiopia. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we
Yep.
can.
On how radio, when combined with ICT, can support the existing extinction communication extension system for the improvement of the diversity between the countries.
Frey, we're having trouble now.
Where's the mic, Sheila? Just
I'm just wondering whether, can you think of anything she can
Can you
do?
hear me? Because I hear it just in background.
Just tell her to repeat if it does. I think it's just your connection.
Yeah, no, you're clear now. I don't know why, but you were breaking up. Let's try again.
Okay. For the past decades, radio has been the dominant source of information for farmers in Ethiopia. It is estimated that 80% of farmers in the area radio, even though there is some hearing.
No, Frey,
Yes.
it's you seem to be all right for a few words, and then
And then this
Yeah. Can you
Because I hear it just in background.
can you think of something?
Like Ethernet,
No,
so that the internet is more stable.
I don't know. Is the internet not stable?
It's the wireless that's.
You
It's
figure?
hers, no, it's hers.
Oh, is
Hey,
it?
Frey, I'm just going to call you back, okay?
All right.
This happens every day at the office.
No, particularly Ethiopia.
Yeah,
as it
in
goes.
Malawi, we have the same problem all the time.
Okay. And we've often
Is
got
she on
somebody
it?
on
I asked her
Ethernet,
to, yeah,
on
it doesn't sound like it,
Skype.
but it does.
in the office, telephone. People forget to mute. Then you hear the people making breakfast.
Yeah.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Frey. Are you on a headset, per se?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
you are? Okay. Give it a go. Let's see what happens. It might be better this time.
Okay.
Maybe, Frey, it's Doug. Try speaking in short phrases with a little pause in between.
Okay. Okay, I'll try.
Great.
For the past decade, radio has been the dominant source of information for farmers in Ethiopia. It is estimated that 80% of households access radio, even though there are some variances from region to region and from neighborhood to Indian households. Much on radios dominating the
It ain't working.
Hey Frey, we're losing you again. Sorry.
Oh my god. Okay.
What's your cell phone? I can give you a call. We can get Heather to present first, and then I can call you on your phone.
Would that be better?
It might be, because it sounds like it's your connection on your side.
Yeah.
Okay. My number is 251
Everyone can call right now. Okay, 251.
911.
Yeah. You're gonna write it out. Heather, you might want to just. Okay, perfect. We'll give you. We'll leave you on Skype for now. Then we'll try to call you after Heather's done.
Why don't we try to call her right now?
I need to load some money onto my.
Okay.
You can do it online if you want. I've got money. That's easier.
Well, I have $10, but.
Mark, or should we try the polycom? Would that be better?
Are you on automatic upload, like real new?
But I think Heather, if you want to just present now, I can do this one.
Okay. Okay, one moment, please. We have technical difficulties. It's like working in Northern Ontario. I have a cottage, and the connectivity problems up there are worse than they are with most of Africa.
Sure. Do you want to just, oh, I see. You'll be using the computer.
Yeah.
Okay, so
So-
don't worry about the slides for now. He's using the computer.
Okay, let me
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
introduce Heather. Da-da-da-da-da-da. Heather Gilberts is a doctoral candidate in the School of Journalism and Communications at Carleton. Her research aims to understand the nature of knowledge brokerage and knowledge translation, and takes a critical look at the production and dissemination of knowledge in the context of information and communication technologies for development. She is also a communication and research specialist at Farm Radio International, and is currently managing a project that uses participatory radio and ICT strategies in the context of global mental health in Malawi and Zambia.
Oh. Is his phone in your end? Where is he? Oh, yeah. Okay.
Okay,
Got a little bit
over to Heather.
Okay, so yeah, as Doug was saying, I basically wear two hats. So the one hat is as a PhD student here at Carleton, and the other one is at Farm Radio. And the project I'm talking about was a project through Carleton University Center for Media and Transitional Societies that had affiliations with Farm Radio, so I'll kind of be bringing both of those into it. So the project that I'm going to talk about today was called Radio Convergence and Development in Africa, and it was an IDRC-funded project which ran from 2009 to 2012. The overall aim of the program was to examine the impact of new digital technologies, so new ICTs such as the ones Sheila's already talked about, the SMS platforms, mobile phones, the internet, on radio for development in Africa. So through the money we got from IDRC, we launched a competitive grant-making process, and we funded 16 research projects throughout Sub-Saharan Africa. So the idea was to support research by African researchers. Once we're finished here, I can show you a map.
Yep.
So our 16 researchers conducted research in 17 countries throughout Africa over the course of the 3 years. So the starting point of the research was the assumption that radio, especially when it's local, independent, and participatory, can be a positive force for development in Africa. The research teams looked at the convergence of radio with a variety of new technologies, some mostly SMS platforms, technologies called Freedom Phone, Frontline SMS, as well as mobile phones, email, the internet, and digital audio production technologies as well. The researchers asked, what does ICT convergence actually mean on the ground in Sub-Saharan Africa? Is it actually emerging as a force for development in Africa? So that was the overarching broad research question. So these are some of the research projects. For the different research teams, this meant different things. So in Sierra Leone and Nigeria, our researchers looked at whether rural women are better equipped to participate in the development process through the integration of new ICTs with radio. In the Great Lakes region, one team looked at diasporic populations and the extent to which new communication technologies are enabling people who have moved abroad to participate in the development and the politics of their home country. In Mozambique and Mali, one research team asked whether new technologies were improving journalism through enhanced interactivity. And in Ghana, one team looked at whether digital recording services and devices added to the reach and impact using radio to promote strategies of climate change adaptation. Those are a few just highlights. Oh, there it is.
There you go.
There were a number of interesting findings, of which I'll touch on a few here, but overall we came out feeling that the results were very mixed. While scholars and practitioners tend to laud new ICTs and their interactive potential, we found that in reality, on the ground, that this claim is fairly underwhelming. In most cases, the integration of new ICTs is far from laudatory. So I'll highlight a few of the positive findings before getting to some of the sort of more underwhelming findings. We found that all 16 teams provided evidence that convergence is indeed happening on the ground at an ever-increasing rate all across Africa. Obviously, the largest convergence that we're seeing is radio with mobile phones. We found that even the smallest, poorest, and most rural stations have embraced new ICTs to some extent. Even the smallest and most remote stations are interacting with their listeners through mobile phones and through SMS. And there is evidence, some teams provided evidence that this convergence is indeed affecting participation and development. So one project was CAP AIDS in Uganda along with Farm Radio International. And they found that by adding two-way interactions with radio programs through SMS platforms primarily about HIV/AIDS, people were more likely to come forward for voluntary counseling and testing. A number of researchers also showed that new technologies allowed for broadcasters to better target information to the needs of the listening communities. However, as I was saying, overall we found that the integration of new ICTs is troubled by a number of factors. So one is the digital divide. ICTs, although many scholars and practitioners will claim that new ICTs, especially 2.0 platforms and mobile phones, will erase the digital divide, but we actually found that they were exacerbating the digital divide in most places. For instance, in Burkina Faso and Benin, only 8% of radio stations stream their audio content on the internet. So typically it's still a one-time listen, and that's the end of it. They don't stream, they don't save it, they don't broadcast outside of their direct community. In South Africa, the old disparities governed by geography, income, and gender still prevail, so South African radio stations are very, very well equipped. However, even in South Africa, we find that there's this sort of typical disparities. Poor and rural stations, while they, that should say use, not sue, newer ICTs. While they are using them to an extent, they're mostly using them to call out to listeners, to have listeners call in, or to send SMS messages to promote their programs. But the kind of tapping into the overall potential of new ICTs is especially not being done by poor and rural stations. We found that cost, and one of the biggest reasons for this is that cost is a huge barrier. This is for the radio stations, especially the ones in rural communities, as well as for the listeners themselves, especially the more marginalized people, such as women and rural people. Level of education was also shown to be a major barrier, especially among women and girls. So we found that even if women and girls had the technologies and the income to participate using mobile phones, typically they still wouldn't, especially if they weren't highly educated. This points to gendered self-confidence as being a barrier. Another big problem that we found has to do with the question of capacity. So we found that while these technologies are available, often radio stations don't have the capacity or the motivation to actually integrate them into their programming. So we're expecting radio broadcasters typically to do two things. One is knowledge translation on a number of complex development issues. And the second is to integrate new ICTs. And we found that they don't actually possess, in many cases, the capacity to do either of these things very well. With new ICTs, radio broadcasters are increasingly asked to do it all, including to translate, as I was saying, a wide host of very complex development issues. We're asking them to fulfill multiple and often conflicting roles as journalists, broadcasters, development brokers, animators, producers, entertainers, and savvy business people all at the same time. There's the capacity-related challenges are exacerbated by the fragile economic conditions under which most radio stations operate. They're typically shoestring operations. Often the human resource capacity is very limited. They're often staffed by volunteers. A lot of the staff members don't have education, yet at the same time we're expecting them to do all these very complicated things. And they're often reliant on donor-sponsored programs. And the final one has to do with are often mixed standards and need for ongoing training. So while we expect the broadcasters to be able to integrate new ICTs and do all of these other things, there's a lack of training, appropriate training for them to be able to take on these roles. Is that the end of it? Okay, so I have more to say here. Okay, so I'll just go over a few of the conclusions that we found as a result of this. So we have a tendency, especially in kind of the academic world, but also I think in the practitioner world, to focus on the technology itself. So we assume that the technology in and of itself is interactive and great and will produce all of these amazing things. But we don't actually look at the contextual, institutional, or individual capacities and constraints. It's important for us working in radio, and especially the integration of new ICTs, to analyze and test our assumptions about what radio broadcasters can and cannot achieve, given their often constrained contexts. Development organizations often expect broadcasters to quickly and adeptly take on any issues and translate them for their listeners. There's a tendency to view a radio station as an institution that comes ready equipped to do the bidding of development organizations. This often results in kind of the NGOization of radio across Sub-Saharan Africa, where they're reliant on development organizations to pay for broadcasting time. And so instead of being responsive to their direct communities, typically they're just responsive to the development organizations. So the topics that they promote and that they broadcast on the radio station are typically defined through what funding is available for particular programs. Another conclusion that we found is that there's a blurring of roles for radio broadcasters, and this is quite a big issue. So while we're expecting them to act as knowledge intermediaries and development brokers, development communicators, we're also expecting them to act as journalists. And those two roles are actually conflicting if you think about it. So if a development organization is paying for a program, that completely goes against the standards of journalism, ethics, objectivity, and autonomy, but they're expected to fulfill both of those roles at the same time. So while we may embrace the potential for new ICTs to enhance radio's participation with listeners, we often found that station managers and broadcasters are often much less enthusiastic. One reason is that new ICTs actually increase their workload by quite a lot. So we really have to convince the broadcasters that starting to log SMS calls, divided according to who calls in, the gender, what they say, we have to convince them that that's a good thing. But typically they don't actually, that's not the reason they came into radio in the first place. They just want to be broadcasters and they want to be animators. And so all of a sudden now we're asking them to become researchers, and typically that's not really why they got involved in the first place. And they see it primarily as something that the donor is requiring. So it's the donor who wants to see who's calling in, what the results are, what the impact is. But typically the radio broadcasters themselves don't necessarily see that as a value-added component. And that's all.
Okay. 1 minute short of Sheila. Wow, you guys, you're great. Does anybody have any questions, clarification questions at this point? Okay, and I'll turn to my beautiful assistant and see whether we can
Frey,
get
we'll just
Freya.
call you, we'll call you back on your phone, I think, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
familiar.
It will work. It's crossed.
Hello?
Hi, Freya, do you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you just fine. Excellent.
Okay.
This should be better. So yeah, just go ahead.
All right. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the experience from the Ethiopian side, whereby when radio is combined with ICT, that it's able to transform the agricultural extension system. Just to give a background on the use of radio in Ethiopia, for the past decades, radio has been the dominant source of information for farmers in Ethiopia. It is estimated that about 80% of households access radio, even though there are some variances from region to region and from male-headed to female-headed households. Battery-powered radios are dominant due to the shortage or non-existence of electricity in the rural area. They are still practical and affordable by most farmers. To reach the large rural audience, especially the marginalized and uneducated section of the society, still radio, with its limitation, is the most appropriate media channel for the rural Ethiopia and for reaching farmers. And to give some background on the agriculture part, 83% of the population of the country depends directly on agriculture for their livelihoods. And agriculture contributes 46.3% of the gross domestic product and up to 90% of foreign export earnings. Thus, to support these and to continually make improvements to the country's agricultural goals, including moving beyond the staple crop production focus, increasing farmer participation, developing capacity at the decentralized level, and improving links to and creating space for other innovation system players such as farmer groups, research, the private sector, and civil society, and increased focus on marketing high-value crops and related inputs. The agricultural extension system is developed these days. At present, there are four major programmatic components of the Ethiopian agricultural extension system. One is the participatory demonstration and training extension system, the farmer training centers, we call them FTCs, the agricultural technical and vocational education, and finally the institutional coordination. But currently, it's estimated that about 8,500 farmers training centers have been established at the Abane level. Abane is the smallest unit of a district, with roughly 2,500 of these farmer training centers reported to be fully functional at the present time. In addition, it was reported that there are about 45,000 development agents currently on duty at the Abane level. These 45,000 development agents are assigned for 15,183 Abanes, and the assumption is that one development agent can conduct a development team, and a development team consists of 5 farmer groups, but not individual farmers. In every Abane, there are more than 20 development teams. Thus, one development agent can find it hard to contact each team at least once in a week or even once in a month. And This shows that there is a limitation on the extension system to reach as many farmers as possible, especially farmers living in areas where there is poor infrastructure, especially in the planting seasons where most of the roads are muddy. In addition to this, the uniformity of information cannot be guaranteed with using only the extension system, the existing extension system, because the transmission of information depends on the understanding of the individual who will be transforming the message to the farmers, and also the language knowledge as well. So there is this argument that there are lots of limitations in the agriculture extension system when reaching most farmers. When we look at the ICT status in Ethiopia, it can play a crucial role in benefiting the resource-starved farmers with up-to-date knowledge and information on agricultural technologies, best practices, markets, price, trends, and weather conditions. However, in Ethiopia, the use of ICT for the accumulation and dissemination of knowledge and information is still low. Apart from such traditional ICT tools like radio and TV, the use of modern ICT such as computer, internet, mobile telephone, etc. remains very low in the country. However, some activities that make use of ICT tools in agricultural knowledge and information management are underway and are worth mentioning. One is the combination of ICT with radio. Currently, among the various ICT-related initiatives, radio is widely used to share and inform users on agricultural issues, including new and upgraded farming techniques, production management, market information, and other issues. Due to this strategic importance in reaching the majority of the smallholders, attempts are being made to strengthen the delivery of knowledge and information through radio programs. The initiative of Farm Radio International is one best case in the use of ICT for agriculture. FRI started its operation in Ethiopia in June 2011. Now it's combining radio with the existing and available ICTs such as fixed line, landline, and mobile phones, telecenters, and the interactive voice response, the IVR. It operates in direct partnership with local radio broadcasters, where it supports them to build the necessary skills to develop content that responds to the needs of local small-scale farmers. FRI's experience shows that when radio combined with the available and existing ICT can transform the extension work in Ethiopia by reaching the wider audience, by being more interactive, whereby farmers will not only be able to access information but also provide information. This facilitates two-way communication. Traditionally, farmers were just receiving information through radio, and some studies show that they were not that much attracted to the traditional way of top-down information flow. But nowadays, we've got this information from our evaluation that the participatory approach encouraged farmers to engage themselves in the radio programs as well, not only listening to the programs, but also to engage themselves in the radio programs as well and participate fully. Our evaluation also shows that farmers who were accessed by the DAs and as well as were listening to the PRCs gained more knowledge compared to those who were contacted by the DAs only. Thank you. That is all.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Freya, and I'm glad we had that good connection. I was worried at the beginning, and it was very important, and I thank Mark very much for making sure that we were able to showcase Frey. Frey, thank you very much. And you have a large and enthusiastic audience here in Ottawa.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, now I get a chance. Is that right?
Yes.
You promised me this, right?
Yeah,
You said
of
if you share, then you can have 5 minutes.
That's okay.
All right. And My name's Doug Ward. I'm the chair of the board of Farm Radio International. I spent 30 years at CBC, and I was on the board of Inter Pares, a small social development agency, for 20 years, and those are my credentials. And I just love being a volunteer worker at Farm Radio International. Radio is the old player in the thing. It's old steam radio. That's the pejorative way of talking about radio. And yet, radio plus cell phones is the newest, sexiest medium there is, because radio does what no one else does, and that is it gets to everybody. That no medium has the penetration into the rural countryside that radio has. But the problem is it's one way. So, but now that there are 100 million cell phones in rural Africa, that means that there are cell phones just about everywhere. Not every smallholder farmer has one, but they're everywhere. And so radio can be a two-way medium, and so that you can get the word out and get farmers' voice on radio, but you can also get feedback from those people and build up your programming. So in fact, radio plus cell phone, it turns out, and this is true, and Heather pointed out that perhaps the most effective thing from all the new sexy media is the old radio with the new cell phone, and that together, and if you combine that with the texting capability of the new cell phone, that's what's used the most for farmers. Now, for the broadcasters, they need the computers. Remember when Negroponte talked about having one computer for every student or kid in the world? Well, talk about a crazy idea. But just having a computer in every radio station in Africa would make a huge difference, so that they can get research, they can edit programming and store programming and archive programming and do their lineups and all that kind of stuff. That would be a revolution. And when you talk about technology, and this conference is all about technology and training to use the technology, my take on that is that the technology is the simple part of it. The hard part is training people to use it effectively. And if there isn't a nice little black box to do something that we want done in radio today, well, there'll be one next week. You know, our tech guys, Mark and Bart, they know that. I mean, the stuff is popping up like mushrooms. So the technology is not the problem, except where, as Heather was saying, it can overcomplicate things. But I think that what we have found, and certainly in the comments that Sheila was making, it's how people use radio, how the broadcasters use radio, whether stuff is just dumped on them or whether they participate in designing the programming in a way that they can engage farmers, and how are farmers engaged in the programming. Those are the important things. And my mantra, which I will say and then end on, is this, that I think radio plus the new ICTs are a wonderful way to have a two-way communication system for development in rural Africa. But I don't think that the main challenge is dissemination of new knowledge, or even dissemination of farmer knowledge. I think that the problem is motivation and mobilization to take up improved practices. And these are really the tough things. And if you're a young farmer and you want to you want to be a farmer, and you've got some education and you've got a smartphone and you've got some land, you're probably going to have a computer soon, and you're probably going to be able to use the ICTs you want to become to help yourself out of subsistence farming and become a small business farmer. And that's a whole group of people, but it's not that big a group of people. the technology will work for them. They will know how to access it and use it, and they have the motivation to improve because they know about markets, they know about inputs, they know about international trade, they know where they can fit into the system. But the problem is there are still hundreds of millions of rural Africans who live on land but who aren't very confident that they can do any better than they did last year when they were able to grow enough maize to last for their family for 6 months or 7 months. And then what the hell do you do? Because the land isn't strong enough to crop twice a year, because the land is getting weaker, because they're only planting corn, and the corn sucks all the nutrients out of the soil. That kind of problem. So the question is, how can development be participatory in a way that these farmers, let's say the 200 million or 300 million rural Africans who aren't business farmers and who aren't, perhaps half of them are not literate, who've been farming the way they always did, but the land's getting worse and there's not enough diversity and they're being hit by climate change, which means that their grain crops are often lodged and destroyed, and they're not growing enough root crops that can last through the climate change, things like that. How can you help those farmers to become agents of their own change and get involved in that change? And we think that there are ways to do that, and we at Farm Radio are doing that with the participatory radio campaigns that Frey has been involved in, and that Sheila's been involved in, and that with any luck Heather will be involved in. And these are the purpose of these campaigns is to help farmers identify improvements that they consider can make a difference to food security in their area, and discuss them and whether they will work in their context, because not everything works in the context, and context has come up today a couple of times. And then, can you help those farmers to make an informed choice to change? Make an informed choice. Maybe the informed choice is, I can't do that, I haven't got enough land, I haven't got enough labor. But if the informed choice is, yes, let's try this new, like interplanting beans with corn to build up the soil. And then have lots of programming after you've done a whole lot of hoopla, gathering those people who have made a commitment to take on a new or an improved practice. And then you do a lot of how to do it programming with farmers talking about troubleshooting how you can do it better. We think that's a way to go with a lot of the farm programming if you really want to have impact. But there's always the question about what does it mean. It sounds quite imperialistic if we say that, these are unmotivated farmers, and we used to think that if we just gave people information, opened their heads, poured in information, then they should take up a new practice. It didn't work, and then we say, well, they betrayed us. We know what they need, and we've given them the information, and they didn't do anything about it. The problem is we're not dealing with that farmer in the situation that farmer is in. You're not dealing with that farmer who has no land tenure, who doesn't know whether it's worth fixing up the land because they may not have access to it next year. Or the woman who's afraid she's lost her husband, and even though the law of the land says that she has the land, the local community may say, that land, sorry, you've lost it, it goes to your husband's family. There are 1,000 reasons for lack of motivation, and I think that's where you go. So it's great we're talking technology, but technology isn't always the solution. Technology can be helpful to the solution, but behind that are people's motivation, and the intermediate organizations and how they can work with the people to help them bring out their potential. Okay, now we've got some time. We don't have to be out of here, here's my watch, until 10:30, right? And so we're open for a full discussion, and we would hope you've got questions and things you want to talk about. Yes, please. Please identify yourself too.
And we'll take the mic around, actually.
Yeah, good.
Hi, my name's Heather. I'm just finishing up my 4th year of my undergrad here at Carleton in African Studies and Political Science. And I guess I kind of have a question for Heather and Sheila about the diversification of farm radio programming. It sounds like there's one in Malawi that's dealing with mental health issues, and there you noted one that also in Uganda was dealing with HIV/AIDS. And I was just wondering if the shift toward non-agriculturally based programming is going to affect the quality of, or if you're concerned about the quality of the programming that's going to be disseminated to the people.
Great question.
I'm gonna ask this part to you, I guess. No problem.
Thanks, Heather. That's a good question, actually. A lot of our work, and over the last 30 years, we've traditionally looked at agricultural development. But what we've also found that agriculture is a large aspect of rural development and rural livelihoods. So touching upon issues such as health and nutrition, and HIV/AIDS, and mental health to a lesser extent, are also challenges faced by rural communities. So we have looked at other aspects of rural development outside of agriculture in the past. In these new projects, what we're doing is we're taking similar approaches that we've developed in our free and our other programs and applying them to non-agricultural programs. And this will allow us to sort of find it'll allow us to test our approaches in other areas of programming. So what that means is that we'll need to include partners that are specialists in other areas outside of agri development. And also trying to work with them, getting them to work with radio stations is sort of the main challenge, and that's what we're trying to work through right now. For my project with child's nutrition, what we're finding is this disconnect between the health networks and nutrition networks and agriculture. Although there's been an increase in the need to combine the two sectors. So we're trying to have better dialogue between the two and create a system for them to sort of speak to each other a little bit more and inform each other a little bit more. Some of the preliminary findings and the baselines are that farmers know a lot about the production of certain crops that are nutritious, such as sweet potato, but they're unaware of the actual nutritional benefits. So the vitamin A component, what is vitamin A good for, and what happens if you're vitamin A deficient. So these kinds of disconnects we'll try to consider in the radio programming and the design of the programs.
Let me just add a tiny bit more from my the big picture of Kevin, because Kevin and I, our CEO, talked about this exactly, almost the same words that you said. Isn't this a big stretch for us to get involved in rural mental health when we are an agriculture extension? However, we are also trying to find what our core capacities are, what do we bring to the table for development, and it's really different kinds of radio programming, and this allows us to work on radio programming for young people, which is a hugely important area in rural Africa, and it also gives us an opportunity to do some very interesting mini dramas. So they're going to be half-hour radio programs that each one has a jewel of a little mini drama episode in it, and storytelling, of course, is a great African skill from time immemorial, and soap opera type mini dramas are the rage, and in an area where there isn't television, it's just as big as soap operas on radio were when I was a kid in Canada. I mean, that's what you listen to. So from an almost selfish point of view, we saw this project as a way for us to build our capacity in doing drama and in doing programming for young people. So we don't see it as diverting us as long as we're adequately funded for it. And I worry about that a bit, because I think that people, that everybody here in this room from Farm Radio is overworked. As long as the projects are well funded, it's really nice to have opportunities to build your core skills.
It's also that we kind of, at the core, we're communication experts. We're not even really agriculture experts. We work with knowledge partners who are agriculture experts, but we're not experts in agriculture, actually. I don't think any of us, or maybe Doug is closest. And so why can't we use that same skill that we apply in agriculture to all other sectors, really? That's kind of what we're thinking. Is like, we've shown a lot of success in this sector, even though we're not experts. So now how can we, get experts on in these other sectors and do what we do really well, which is produce good radio programs.
Yeah, and Heather, I'm going to jump in even though I'm not part of
Jump
that.
in.
Convergence programming, and that was pretty exciting for us to see. Like, we had no idea if this stuff would work when we went into that IDRC funded project for Convergence, and using some of the modalities that Sheila talked about in AFRI, such as sending SMS reminders. We did this thing where we'd send a reminder 15 minutes to half an hour before a program just to get people to listen. Those same types of modalities were used to actually remind people to take their ARVs, or to actually tell them where the clinics were in Uganda, and the results of that were similar. You know, it was the same type of idea. If you engage a station and you let them actually produce the program together and be involved and utilize these technologies properly, you can actually have effect, I think, in health. And we'll find out about mental health in the coming months, but certainly nutrition. Sheila's working on a lot of stuff with that. So it's all interlinked.
Okay, other questions or statements, opinions? Please, would you identify yourself so we've got...
Yeah,
Yeah.
John Bosco Maiga I'm a PhD candidate in media studies at the University of Western Ontario. But before that, I worked in Uganda in media development and had the opportunity to work on a project which was working radio and peace building. So I have an experience of working with radio and some of the difficulties working with radio in an African context. And I should say that I'm happy that from the presentations that I've followed since I came in, that you don't sort of fetishize technology as we usually hear from dominant accounts, where technology is presented as sort of an autonomous force of its own, especially within African context. The mobile phone, I think what talks about how the mobile phone is transforming Africa, and some of those narratives obscure some of the limitations that actually limit the extent to which technology is able to be productive. You mentioned the issue of, for example, land tenure, some of those contextual difficulties that can limit the extent or the impact of technology even in the context of radio. I'm wondering, looking at your specialization, agriculture and radio and convergence, what is your level of engagement in some of those broader limitations, which could also extend to things that are related to technology itself, like, for example, the provision of electricity, the spread of infrastructure for access to mobile phones, which limit the capacity for different people to participate in the process, in the interactive process. And is that Sheila? Is that your name?
Heather, yeah.
Okay, so I was reading from.
Yeah, no problem.
You talked about the issue of professionalism, and you sort of mentioned the contradiction that we think about so much about the radio worker from a journalistic perspective. So we want to sort of impose standards based on our perception of what is journalism professionalism, which is one of the problems we encountered in Uganda. So how do we talk about professionalism for someone who has never had a background in journalism, but is a communicator in their own sense, and they're actually doing aspects of journalism? Could you elaborate more on that, how you negotiate that kind of contradiction?
Yeah, actually that is a huge contradiction. It's one thing that's really, really difficult. I don't know if you know Bruce Gerard. Do you know Bruce Gerard?
No.
He's a kind of radio for development kind of guru working a lot in South America, and he really makes, I don't know that I agree with it, but he makes a pretty clear distinction between journalists and development communicators. He doesn't think it's the same job. He says, you know, we have a tendency to conflate those two, but that's actually, those are two different jobs entirely. And so if you're working with a community broadcaster who's doing development programs, he would say that's not a journalist, that's a development communicator. And journalists need to adhere to standards of objectivity, need to be reporters, and need to be et cetera, et cetera. But that's just not, I don't think that's a useful distinction, because in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa, those people are the same people, they're doing the same things. So one thing that, well, I mean, it's really difficult. So we provide with farm radio quite a bit of training. So that's one thing that's value added for the broadcasters in partnering with us, is we provide training on different sort of broadcasting techniques, on these participatory radio campaigns, on how broadcasters can become researchers and do their own research with their listening communities. But we don't do a lot on journalism itself. Part of the problem with doing that is that the journalism context is completely different. So sort of being paid to attend an event and write a story about it is common practice throughout Sub-Saharan Africa. So journalists primarily are people who are paid to cover particular events a lot of the time, especially if they're working, well, in any media organization actually. So the context of journalism is, I think it's just inappropriate to apply like what we think of as journalism standards to a context where that's not even possible in a lot of places. So a lot of places where there's like strict censorship, where the conditions of journalists where they're very, very poor. And so a lot of the ways that they make money is through per diems to attend particular events. Within that context, it's almost impossible to apply the same standards of journalism here as there. So I think the best we can do is within the particular sectors that we're working in, development sectors, is do things like training about knowledge partners. So one aspect of our training, and we're doing this a lot in the mental health project, is we're connecting the broadcasters who are working on the project with knowledge partners, so with experts. And so we're also doing, I just got back from Laos yesterday, and we did a 3-day training session on mental health with the broadcasters by mental health experts. So that's one thing that we are hopefully going to start moving. We've done that in some other programs, but I think we're trying to figure out ways within farm radio to start moving towards that model. So if we're doing a particular campaign, that the broadcasters need to get training from the experts in that field. So if the campaign is something to do with nutrition, then they need to get training by nutrition experts. We're trying to build that into a training model is also the content expertise. And it's also where do you go if you don't know the correct information. So if you're the broadcaster and you're doing a program about mental health or about sweet potato and you don't actually know, how do you find that information? So another aspect that we're doing is trying to train broadcasters on how to seek out experts themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's about learning a certain process for developing programs that should be applied to other themes and
But as broadcasters, once they learn those skills, they can hopefully start applying them to their work in general.
yeah. One area that we're also quite sensitive about is ensuring that the information that is broadcast is high quality and correct. So we're working
A little louder, I don't know whether,
closer.
is Frey still with us?
She's still there, yeah.
Hi, Frey, can you hear us while we're talking?
Oh, me? Yeah.
No, I'm shouting all the way to Addis Ababa.
Can you still hear us?
Frey, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
I don't know, can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Can you hear us?
Can you hear me now?
Okay. Sheila, go
It's a
ahead.
bit far, but I can hear you.
Okay.
So one of the areas that we're looking at is ensuring that the information that is broadcast is accurate and true. And so we're working out better ways to monitor that information as it's broadcast and ways that we can ensure that listeners are getting the right information. That's sort of one of the challenges, one of the criticisms of using radio in development.
Yeah, like one thing we're doing with the mental health project is that we've done with others is setting up an advisory board, and the advisory board is experts in that area, and then they listen to the radio programs and then provide feedback about the content. So that's one thing that we're trying to set up.
Does Frey have a comment about journalism?
Ray, do you want to comment about that idea of journalism and development communication?
The line is breaking. Can someone repeat the question for me, please?
Yeah. I think it's going to be hard for Frey to pick up from now. But Frey, your context in Ethiopia is an interesting one because, are you there? We might,
Yes.
you're there, okay.
Go ahead, someone else.
Yeah, the line is breaking.
Okay, well, we may have to say goodbye to you.
Do it again though, she can hear. Just
Can you hear
speak
me?
into the mic though, you need to have the mic. She can't hear you if you're speaking across the.
Hi, can you hear me, Frey?
Yes, clearly now.
Okay. You are working in an interesting context because the Ethiopian government, it's a strong, almost single-party country, and the Ethiopian government pretty well identifies what improvements it is that it wants its farmers to do. So that's different from a place where perhaps we say, well, farmers get together and decide what you could do that would be an improvement. The government will decide that there's a better maize or there's something a better way to plant teff or whatever. And I wonder whether farmers have much opportunity in Ethiopia to give their comments and to express their opinions about farming and about extension on air. Can farmers speak their minds about farming on the radio, Frey?
Yes, definitely. From our experience in the past 2 years, whatever the government is making decision on is based on the needs from the fields. First, the researchers go down to the fields. They do the research, and they do the research together with the farmers and the development agents. So the content initially comes from the farmers, and finally the decision maker is the government. That's what we've learned through our 2 years experience in this country. Because whatever content is going to be sent back to the farmers is the content that they have developed themselves. So they're free to express their opinions, to pose their questions, and even like, for instance, we've come up with when we were working on the teff technology, on the improved planting technology of teff, farmers openly were saying that raw planting is something that they don't want to accept initially. But gradually, at the end of the campaign, some farmers were giving in because they've heard other farmers sharing their experience on how it has helped them improve their productivity. So we engage farmers who have the experience, the early adopters, to share their experience to other farmers. And the radio station is also entertaining opinions of the other farmers who resist not to accept the improved technology. So there is this level of freedom on expressing whatever they feel about the improved technology.
Okay, thank you. So there's a tough situation to be in, where you've got a very tight state, and radio is quite closely controlled, but the government understands that for improvement to happen, they have to let farmers have their voice, and they go out and they listen to the farmers, and even in the planting, and when farmers are saying, we don't like row planting, but they say, well, let's listen to some farmers who are having success with row planting rather than just throwing the seed around. And then they see that there's a benefit to it. There's a better yield from it. So I think even quite a tight government like the Ethiopian one understands that for there to be a wide-ranging success in a country with 70 million people, it has to allow people to speak their minds if they're going to engage them in improvement. Let me also just comment, because you asked a question about the technology and new technologies, and to what extent we try to help people to get them. Well, first of all, radio, we don't try to help people get radios because they're everywhere. And where would you start to hand out radios? And even if you handed out radios, wouldn't that just destroy a market for small companies that sell radios? So we're not a development agency that gives stuff to people, except we encourage radio stations to provide free programming to people. Cell phones have happened on their own, and no amount of either, governments haven't really subsidized them. There's just such a demand for it that cell phones have developed on their own, and they've gotten into the poorest areas of Africa on their own. However, there are big differences. The radios in many places are controlled by the husband. And in the way that I can remember in the 1950s or 60s, when you sat down at night to watch television, the father controlled what channel of television the family would watch. And so that's happening in radio in some parts of Africa. But then as soon as the man goes out to the field, the woman brings out her little radio and listens to her programs. And the kids have their little radio and they listen to theirs. And often the kids are listening to the private stations that are playing popular music. The mother is listening to the community station and the father's listening to the national broadcaster. So we don't do much to provide the new technologies. We're finding that they're getting spread pretty well. We have, in some cases, given cell phones to a woman in a community so that we will hear women's voices back from that community. And that kind of thing is a good thing to do. If women don't have access to providing feedback, then for just the price of airtime, if you know that there's a woman in a village and she has the telephone that's accessible by women, then you can get feedback that way. Another thing, of course, is just sheer literacy, because SMS only works if you can spell. And so we're involved a lot in developing voice stuff, because you don't have to be literate for that. So that's breaking another boundary. So there are some areas where we are working with the new technologies to make them more accessible. Some where we just expect the market and demand to provide it. That's about all I can say. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions, other comments? We've got some time. We've got 5 minutes. At the back, please, sir. You are?
I came late, I didn't hear what you said, so I don't want to engage in a discussion I did not actually master very well. So I don't have anything to say.
Okay, well, thanks for coming.
Yeah, maybe the only thing is what you said about technology, the fact that it's not the only it's a solution, but not the only solution. We should go beyond introducing technology. I think that it's true. I agree. I entirely agree with it.
Yeah. The technology usually turns out to be the easiest part of it. It's all the people stuff that's harder.
And also, we hear people saying that, for example, cell phones are the technology that is the most widely appropriated by Africans. But what you're just saying, for example, about radio, shows that it's not entirely true. Because, for example, there is barely any African family with not a radio. Everywhere you go, people have radio. So it's just that you cannot go around with radio in your pocket. But otherwise, I am sure radio would be as widely appropriated as, for example, cell phone is. So it's not entirely new that this technology is the only one that has ever been appropriated by Africans, etc. And that's exactly what you are saying about radio. Radio is something that is everywhere today. It's very common, even the remotest village, even among the pastoralists who are in the desert, anywhere you go, they have radio. So some technologies are actually in Africa, have been there for quite a while and everywhere in everybody's family. Such is the case for radio. And,
Right. And that's how we feel about it. Radio is the great fundamental medium on which we can add a lot of these new technologies.
absolutely.
Well, I think our time is up. Is there anybody with wants to make a last comment? I'd like to thank then everybody, Heather and Sheila and Frey for their presentations. I think it's been good for us to be able to look at this whole conference topic of Africa Communicates with the development perspective. It's a huge thing. It isn't being done that well. We think we've got things to learn, but we've also got some things to say, and we are glad that you folks were here to hear some of it. So thank you very much.